Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the APTA FTA webinar on how to engage your transit asset management stakeholders. We will get started in about a minute or so.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Laura Zale, and I'm the Manager of Asset Management at SEPTA in Philadelphia. And I'm here today as the Chair of the Transit Asset Management Working Group. The presentations today will feature two papers that were developed by that group. I'd also like to, at this time, acknowledge our event co-sponsor, the FTA. The FTA has helped to develop this webinar series to advance the practice of asset management. With us today is Lexa Galante, and Lexa is a critical member of FTA's asset management team, and if you've been to any of the State of Good Repair roundtables over the summer, you saw Lexa being a critical component of that effort.
Hi, I'm Lexa Galante. I'm with FTA's Transit Asset Management Program. Mr. Dodie Smith will be joining us later. Thank you for attending. This is an FTA-APTA joint webinar that supports the asset management program. I just wanted to welcome you to the webinar today, and now I'll hand it back over to Laura.
Thank you. Before we begin the actual webinar itself, I wanted to address some frequently asked questions on a webinar. The slides for today's presentation are going to be available. They are in the section of the webinar with handouts. The documents that we will be discussing are available on APTA's website, and we will provide a link to those so that you can download them. And throughout the course of the presentation, if a question comes to mind for a presenter or something that you would like to discuss at the end, please put your questions into the chat box so that we can address them. Next slide, please, Elizabeth. Great. I know we have some folks that have been on many of our webinars, but we also have some folks that may be joining us for the first time. And so I wanted to give you a background of who APTA is. APTA leads public transportation in a new mobility era, advocating to connect and build thriving communities. Where we see ourselves as a voice for public transportation. We support the needs of public transportation agencies through a lot of folks that volunteer a lot of time to develop standards or put together best practices for our neighboring agencies. And finally, we like to help members anticipate, prepare for, and understand the changes that are happening and how to apply those best practices to their own agency environment. Next slide, please. APTA has been particularly helpful and supportive of the TAM effort. Here are a couple of the committees that we are involved in. We have a Transit Performance Management Subcommittee. We have the State of Good Repair Transit Asset Management Working Group, who will be showcasing some of their work today. We have public outreach like this webinar series. APTA sponsors research and reports, most recently the one called Economic Cost of Failing to Modernize Public Transportation, which touches on asset management, state of good repair issues, and public funding. And throughout the year, APTA supports a number of conferences and sessions to talk about many subject areas, including asset management. APTA will be co-sponsoring the TRB Asset Management Conference in Boston in 2020. Next slide, please. I'll give you a little bit of background about the State of Good Repair Transit Asset Management Working Group, and boy, is that a mouthful to say. We are a relatively recently reconvened group. We got back together in 2018 with the mission of developing guidance for transit agencies as they implement asset management and as they continue to improve. The group is made up of about 20 members from public transit agencies, from MPOs, DOTs, as well as a few consultants who have expertise in this area. Next slide, please. To date, we have published 4 recommended practices, and we have quite a few in development. All of these are available on our APTA website. We have recently published Communicating Your TAM Plan, Improving TAM Through Asset Information, and then the 2 papers that are the subject of today's webinar about communication. Next slide, please. We have a few documents in development currently. We have a product where we are working on recommended practices for procuring software to support TAM. We have a new product that we just started to work on addressing asset criticality in your capital programming decisions. And finally, we have another one coming out about building an asset management team. We anticipate that these documents will be ready in winter, spring of 2020. Next slide, please. As we continue to develop guidance, we've taken a look at what information the FTA has put out, as well as what sort of guidance and what sort of best practices we see around the agency. And we really see ourselves as being the voice of continuous improvement in TAM, that element 9 of the required TAM requirements in the FTA asset management rule. So that will be the theme of the activities you see as we go forward. Next slide, please. As a part of the development of documentation and as a part of supporting FTA, we've continued to work on this webinar series where we'll be continued to not only share the work that we've done, but to initiate dialogue with the industry. We had a webinar in April to talk about communicating TAM compliance. Today we are talking about TAM stakeholders, and in the next one we have planned for late fall 19 or winter of 20 will be best practices for data collection and data governance. Next slide, please. So now that I've given you all the APTA background, let's talk about what you all registered to hear about today, which is stakeholder engagement. This is an area that when everybody talks about starting an asset management program, this idea of whether the initiative starts from the top down or the bottom up, engaging your stakeholders at various levels of implementation is really, really important. Next slide, please. And really, that engagement happens not only in your agency, but also outside of your agency as well. But when you look at within your agency, whether you maintain your assets complete with in-house forces or whether you have consultants or third party or a mix, there are many, many stakeholders that are involved with each of the assets throughout the asset's life cycle. And the success of your program, of your asset management implementation, really hinges on your ability to engage with all of those stakeholders, whether you're in the beginning stages of design, through building or maintaining the asset, to the actual folks that maintain and operate that asset out in the field. Next slide, please. But in a post-asset management rule world, there was a lot of focus on sharing asset information to make better decisions. And while a lot of folks were doing that within agencies, this idea of coordinating with external stakeholders with this kind of data is relatively new. So you can see in the publications that have come out from the FTA how they envision the world going, but as we all know that there could be many people that work in all of these entities, all of whom need to be coordinated with in order to have a successful TAM implementation, not only within your agency, but also within your region. Next slide, please. So in order to talk about all of these things, we have a couple of folks from our Asset Management Data Good Repair Working Group. Our first speaker, I'm sorry. Next slide, please. Again, I'm going to introduce the panelists before each of their presentations, but as questions come up, or if you think of something you'd like to ask them, please submit your dialogue into the chat box so that we can answer your questions. Next slide. Okay. Our first speaker is Victor Rivas. Victor is a program manager and researcher with over 18 years of experience researching transportation-related problems and implementing transportation solutions with an emphasis on capital programming and asset management. Prior to joining Jacobs, Victor led the team in charge of managing the capital investment program for the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority. And Victor is going to talk to us today about the first paper that we published, Building Internal Stakeholder Support for an Asset Management Program. Thanks, Victor.
Thank you, Laura. Good morning and good afternoon. This recommended practice document highlights a wide-ranging nature of asset management and how it relates to core functions of transit organizations. The document further explains the benefits of asset management to the entire agency and to individual departments. The document includes challenges commonly found by asset managers seeking engagement and support for asset management efforts. Finally, the document provides strategies on how to gain internal stakeholder support for transit asset management related activities. Next slide, please. Who are the internal stakeholders? Next slide, please. Internal stakeholders are personnel involved in the provision of transportation services and their supporting activities. It starts at the top with the accountable executive, the senior leadership, and all operations and maintenance personnel, as well as administrative and clerical staff. It also includes contracted personnel. Next slide, please. Why it's important to build internal stakeholder support for asset management? Next slide. The implementation of asset management principles ensures that agencies put forth their best efforts to maintain, monitor, and invest in their assets to restore them or keep them in a state of good repair. It also contributes to improving their short and long-term planning to optimize performance while minimizing risk and maximizing return on investment. Next slide, please. Adopting an asset management culture shifts the focus to the value of assets of the organization over the long term. Having an asset management program in place allows agencies to move to a more proactive approach to maintaining and replacing their assets. This framework allows for the collection of condition, performance, and risk information that can be used to make more strategic decisions about the asset portfolio. Next slide. Since transit operators vary in their organizational structure, this recommended practice identifies the key functions of typical transit agencies and describes how these functions relate to common asset management practices. The document further describes benefits of applying asset management principles to each of these functions. In the aggregate, by applying sound asset management principles, the agency can benefit by optimizing the use of resources, both human and financial, while delivering the best value to customers. Increased interdepartmental communication is a key element and benefit of implementing asset management within the organization, as well as improved public image. Another important element and benefit of implementing asset management is having enhanced opportunities for highlighting and replicating best practices. Next slide. The document includes a table that shows how most core functional units of a transit organization already perform asset management related actions. The table also incorporates how improving asset management maturity levels bring tangible benefits to each functional unit. Now, going back to the question of this segment, why is it important to build internal stakeholder support for asset management? Advancing asset management to a higher level of maturity is something that cannot be achieved by a single department or operational unit. Therefore, it requires the support and engagement of the entire organization. Next slide. Selling the asset management ideas to the organization face challenges. Next, we will see a few examples of those challenges. Next slide. A common challenge that asset managers face is that many times employees do not understand the relevance or impact of asset management in their daily activities. This is due to asset management not being mentioned, taught, or expected during the onboarding and hiring process, and it is often not modeled. Strategy: articulate, reiterate, model expectations. Through articulating and reiterating the full picture of agency accomplishments in asset management and focusing on the goals for the future, a template is laid out where productive conversation can begin, because employees have the foundational knowledge needed to contribute. As a result, the agency is recognizing the relevance and efforts of internal stakeholders. When approached in a manner that recognizes that each individual has a valid opinion, through this conversation, people are more likely to embrace change as they feel appreciated. Further, through this level of awareness, internal stakeholders understand the relevance and impact their role has across the agency. Next slide. Another challenge that asset managers face is that people are too busy to deal with additional work. Strategy: create and build team culture. The goal for the entire transit organization is to provide safe and reliable service. In order to achieve an agency-wide approach, it needs to be emphasized as a fully collaborative effort that requires all departments within the agency to work together to accomplish the goal. This will require raising awareness among internal stakeholders about their share of responsibility in achieving the goal, and how their contributions are instrumental to the success of the operation. Through a fully collaborative effort, all departments and staff members will not only be aware of their contributions, but also will be held accountable to play their role in the effort. Next slide, please. Another challenge is to find personnel that are not interested in the subject matter. A common phrase that we hear is, "It's not in my job description." Strategy: develop personal buy-in. People who feel valued tend to go the extra mile. There will always be those who are resistant to additional responsibilities, but those people do not have to be the model or the voice of the agency. Generally, this resistance is due to a lack of understanding of where their roles fit within the bigger picture and how the work being done across the agency can positively impact the work for which they are responsible. Organizations that have figured out how to tap into workers' self-motivation thrive. The paper includes several other challenges that asset managers might encounter when trying to sell the asset management agenda to the organization. Those to be found in the paper. Next slide, please. How does the organization achieve and sustain asset management buy-in? Next slide. It is important to convey to all staff why asset management is important to the organization. It should be noted that asset management is not confined to a single area, but it reaches all core functions of the agency. The message should further elaborate on the path the agency is expected to take and the implications for departments and stakeholders. The message should highlight roles and responsibilities of individual stakeholders to asset management, while emphasizing the benefits to the departments and the agency as a whole. Making the entire agency aware is a huge task and is not a one-time event. In order to ensure that this is a continual process, an agency might want to consider establishing asset management liaisons or TAMbassadors in each office division. They will serve as the department's first asset management point of contact and as a member of the TAM team for the agency. This is a key first step in helping to ensure that the asset management message is spread uniformly across the agency. As the TAMbassadors become more aware of the asset management documents, requirements, and projects, they can in turn become the educators for their own departments. TAMbassadors are responsible for ensuring that asset management is a regular point of discussion at their monthly staff meetings and that they are offering what they are learning to the rest of their office. Next slide. No. Sorry. Let's keep the slide. I'll continue. To educate and keep staff and contractors informed of critical asset management activities, the asset management manager can use a number of avenues, such as the use of printed and electronic media, briefings, and deployment of special asset management workshops. In the case of printed and electronic media, to keep the organization informed of asset management related actions and to share asset management general knowledge, the team that manages asset management in the organization might want to consider using newsletters, briefings, journals, web pages, among other media. The manager will benefit from having long-term communication strategy in place that progressively disseminates information with the goal of educating, engaging, and ultimately encouraging stakeholders to actively support and participate in asset management-related actions. Regular briefings. The asset management manager might want to use staff and management team meetings as opportunities to disseminate asset management information and to lay the groundwork for seeking support for upcoming asset management activities. The asset management team should prepare special briefings for the top management to keep them up to date on high-level asset management-related issues, such as the submission of the National Transit Database Asset Inventory Module, performance measures, triennial reviews, and a special state of good repair reports. Targeted workshops. Offering high-level overview of asset management to senior executives and all ranking files of the organization, it's a great idea to begin gaining their buy-in. It is important to point out that to reach people across the agency, one needs to focus on making the subject material relevant to each office, division, and operational mode in distinct manner. So in other words, the message has to be tailored to where it goes. Next slide. As required by the FTA Transit Asset Management Rule, starting at the top, the accountable executive should lead the organization by clearly delineating and stating the important role each department plays in the delivery of a successful asset management plan. The agency might benefit greatly from the creation of an asset management executive team. This group might be comprised of the agency's top executives, which should include the top executive officer and might include the head of operations, budget and finance, planning and programming, engineering, human resources, safety, IT, legal department, procurement. This depends on the configuration of the organization. What is important to point out is that this group might choose to meet at least twice a year to be updated on the latest transit asset management related actions. The creation of this group can be instrumental in moving the organization's asset management agenda forward. The asset management manager should work closely with department heads to keep them informed and engaged in asset management actions relevant to their department. Next slide. Strong asset management endorsement from the top should place special efforts to gain buy-in from frontline employees. The promotion efforts might want to highlight the benefits to the organization as a whole, but also the benefits to individual departments. Then asset management can also take root organically from the bottom. Next slide. Asset management processes should be ongoing and involve evaluating and managing the relationships among costs, risks, and performance over the asset's life cycle. The TAM framework has 3 categories of business processes that need to be constantly assessed and evaluated against one another to ensure continuous alignment. And those 3 core business processes are the asset management vision and direction, life cycle management of asset categories or types, and cross-asset planning and management. Next slide. To ensure the viability of asset management in the long term, the agency might consider workforce development strategies, which can include recruitment of personnel with a skill set capable of supporting asset management functions, in-house asset management training, and this refers to both initial and periodic refreshers, as well as succession planning to ensure that asset management knowledge and the knowledge base in place is preserved. In conclusion, building internal stakeholder support for asset management is an effort that cannot be confined to certain units or layers of the organization. To be successful, this effort must fully engage all levels of the organization, from the top executive to frontline employees. All internal stakeholders must understand the overall benefits of the program, as well as their individual roles and responsibilities. In similar fashion, the successes of the program must be shared and celebrated by the entire organization. This concludes my presentation.
Thank you very much, Victor. That was very interesting. I always appreciate the insight that Victor is able to provide on asset management, not only in his role currently at Jacobs, but from his previous expertise that he acquired at the T. So thank you, Victor. If you have questions for Victor, I did want to reiterate that if you have the questions, use the question box found on your screen to submit the questions, and we'll read them during the Q&A section for the panelists to answer. So let me introduce our next speakers. Jordan Holt is the Director of Performance at the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority. That's DC's Metro, or also known as WMATA. She leads performance management, reporting, and improvement for the agency, including setting TAM and asset-level performance targets. Jordan has worked in performance management for 15 years after beginning her career as a Peace Corps volunteer, where she taught English and economics in 2 high schools. Talk about a communications expert. Todd Lang is the Director of Transportation Planning at the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, which serves as staff to the federally designated Metropolitan Planning Organization, representing the 2.7 million residents of the Baltimore region. As director, Mr. Lang oversees the MPO work program, including development of the region's short and long-range transportation plans, and he currently serves as the vice president of the Association of Metropolitan Planning Organizations. Todd and Jordan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Awesome, thank you. This is Jordan, and this is the companion piece to what Victor was talking about. He spoke about communicating with internal stakeholders, and we're going to talk about communicating with external stakeholders. As Laura showed earlier in the slide, transit agencies are required to communicate with some external stakeholders as we set targets and share TAM plans with MPOs, but we're here to convince you that you should be communicating even more often with external stakeholders, besides when you just have to. So we're going to go through the who, what, when, where, why, and how of communicating with your external stakeholders. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Todd to talk about who.
So there's going to be many stakeholders who could take an interest in your transit asset management plan, and it's very important to know who these are and what role they play when you're determining how to communicate it effectively. You want to be able to craft your message to best address the stakeholders' concerns and to help generate a positive response. So who are these groups that could take an interest? First of all, it's obviously if you're a large transit agency and you have a transit board, they are going to have a great deal of interest. These transit boards are normally your governing bodies. They approve your budgets and they work programs, but we consider them somewhat of an external audience in that they probably weren't directly involved in the development of your transit asset management plan. So you'll need to explain the intricacies of why you're doing the plan and what the benefits are. You also need to think about your board members. They could have a wide range of expertise in transit planning, programming, and operations. So you got to understand that in your messaging. And transit boards are likely to be focusing on the budgetary impacts of your transit asset management plan. When you think about municipal administrations, most smaller transit systems are funded and operated at the municipal level. So the transit administrator will typically report to a department head or a municipal administrator. And again, the level of expertise of that audience should be recognized as you're developing a presentation of your transit asset management plan. You should really try to stay away from the jargon of our industry and acronyms. You've heard a lot of acronyms and jargon earlier in this presentation. Think about who you're presenting these to, and they won't know what a TAMP is, or a TAM, or a state of good repair. You're going to need to define these terms and make it relatable to the audience that you're working with. When you're talking about metropolitan planning organizations, they have a federally defined role in your transit asset management plan. MPOs, again, are required for any census-defined urbanized area that has a population of over 50,000. So there's about 400 of these across the United States, and your transit agency is likely reporting to this Metropolitan planning organization if you aren't already a member of that planning organization. So the MPO is responsible for planning and programming federal transportation funds, and per the federal rulemaking, MPOs are responsible for setting regional performance targets for transit asset management. So you need to think about their boards. They're made up of state and municipal elected officials or department heads. You've got to think about the role that the MPO plays within your region. They may play the actual leading role in selecting projects that will be funded, or they may play a more of a passive role in kind of confirming project selections by the transit agency or the State Department of Transportation. So it's very important to understand the role that the MPO plays, and then also the level of expertise that the board members may have as you're presenting transit asset management information to them. And then also think about the MPO staff. MPO staff are typically small, and they don't normally have a full-time transit planner, so they are part-time transit planners. So you will actually probably have to work with the staff to try to explain the terms that you're talking about as you're going through the development of the presentation and working with them to best craft it for the MPO board. So thinking about state departments of transportation, they could take the lead in developing group TAMPs for the smaller transit agencies. And most state DOTs do have a full-time staff member that's dedicated to coordinating with the transit agencies. So state DOTs, again, can play a wide variety of roles, including regulatory, funding, oversight, and operations of these different transit systems. FTA is obviously an audience in a number of different fashions. They administer the federal transit funding, they define the TAM requirements, but they also perform our periodic audits, triennial reviews to verify that the TAM plan is being implemented and they are complying with the requirements. So FTA is both a consumer of the transit agency's TAM plan and then also a resource for helping to prepare it. Then we can also start thinking about other elected officials. And some of these elected officials you may have already seen on your MPO board or on your transit board, but then there are also other various elected bodies, such as municipal councils, commissions, and state general assemblies. Again, they play a wide range of roles, regulatory, funding, oversight, and messaging is key. You got to go into your presentation saying, what do you want them to take away from our presentation? And again, make sure that there's no jargon or acronyms. In terms of media, you should always be prepared to handle media requests. So make sure that if you have a dedicated media person, that you bring them on early. Your TAM plan may be referenced in a budget or capital improvement program. So even if you don't make an official press release of your TAM plan, the media may pick up on some of the language that is used in some of these other documents. And in terms of responding to media requests effectively, you've got to understand that your TAM plan may contain a hidden headline, and you want to make sure you have a role in crafting what that headline is, should it come out in any type of media. In terms of public and public interest groups, you got to think about the riders, you got to think about advocacy groups and the public at large. You probably should work with your executive leadership to make sure that you're proactively providing this information and how best to respond to requests for individual information. And then think about the other auditors that you may be facing in addition to FTA. You could be audited by internal groups, external organizations. This could be your elected officials or even the Government Accountability Office. So think about all of these different stakeholders and how you want to try to craft your message and make sure that it is understandable and you are getting across exactly what you want to. Now, Jordan is going to talk about why is communicating your TAM effectively important.
Thanks, Todd. So, looking at that multitude of external stakeholders, it can maybe seem a little complicated and risky to start communicating with all of them. But I'm here to tell you that there are benefits of making them all your ally, in particular to get them all to agree that your common goal is to provide safe, reliable service for your customers. And that by communicating your transit asset management plan and your needs, that you all can come to a shared understanding of what needs to be done. That's really consensus about what investments are needed and how those investments should be prioritized. no surprises down the line, or no kind of diversion of funds to shiny new things at the end. The second reason is increased credibility. It can build trust. You can trust each other and have conviction that everyone's acting in good faith and in the public's interest. And then it should lead to improved results. It can increase the likelihood of getting the funding that you need. And for your stakeholders, a little bit about where and when you should be communicating.
So these next series of slides involves approaches to communicating effectively with external stakeholders regarding a transit agency's transit asset management plan. So effective coordination may require a number of different informal and formal means of communication. When we think about informal communication, you want to think about your peer-to-peer discussions, you want to think about information sharing, and basically that day-to-day coordination that goes along with it. You want to think about your elevator speech. If you have nothing written and no graphics, how are you going to talk about this TAM plan? Then there's the more formal approaches. These are the ones that really require additional planning and preparation. And you want to think also about the federal requirements, that these are just a basic minimum. They don't tell the whole story of your transit asset management plan, and you shouldn't feel constrained to just those individual 4 measures that are required per the federal rule. So once it is developed, the TAM plan itself is really the agency's primary means for communicating asset condition and performance, the investment needs, and the other information related to the agency's TAM program. So you should think about accessible formats. You think about the websites and the posters and the fact sheets that you might want to do. And we have a lot of good examples in the paper. But then also you think about the reports and plans. You want to prepare things like an executive summary to make sure that you're able to kind of condense this information and be able to carry it forward, and people don't have to read those very long documents that you are required to put together. And then think proactively about the media, and think about press releases and social media to make sure that you're proactively getting your story out there. So Jordan's going to continue on with how do you communicate effectively.
Great. So first off, you need to know what you want. You need to focus on why you're communicating this information. You know, are you seeking more funding, or are you just communicating for information purposes only? So then the second thing is to know what your audience's interests are. Like Victor said, with internal stakeholders, just like that, with external stakeholders, you need to tailor your message. And really that, I think the first slide that we had where Todd was going through the different stakeholders, and there's some key questions there, that can help you maybe hone in on what a particular audience's interest is. You know, some might be more interested in knowing which assets are in the worst condition. Others want to know, will your current investment portfolio bring them into state of repair? The third suggestion is to avoid the weeds. Focus on big asset groups. Talk about buses, talk about trains, talk about facilities. You don't need to get really into detail about brands of facility or things like that. Also, conditions can get point scale. It can be hard to know the difference between a 2 and a 3 or a 1 and a 2. We suggest you kind of bucket it into 2 buckets. So you can talk about assets that are in fair or better condition and those that are in marginal or worse condition. There's kind of an example of that over on the right there. Finally, the last 3 are almost generic to any type of communication, but we suggest you be clear and succinct. Think about your elevator speech. What are your headlines, and really hit those. Use simple bar or line graphs. You want people to take away your message, and really those are the types of graphs that are most effective in that. And then provide context and use pictures. I like the example over on the right. It really hones in on when we talk about cutaway buses. What are those? I honestly probably wouldn't have been able to tell you before looking at that picture. So those are the key strategies for how to communicate about transit asset management with your stakeholders. Next up, we're going to talk about what do you need to communicate.
So everyone out there is trying to understand, okay, how do we communicate what this TAM is and what does it entail? I mean, it's really important to communicate the basic TAM concepts clearly and succinctly. TAM is really a set of tools that and approaches for helping manage physical transit assets more efficiently. So all transit agencies really practice asset management in some form and have been doing this for a long time. Now it's just a way of formalizing this information. Many transit agencies are making better use of data to yield better outcomes, and TAM helps agencies best maintain their assets. It's basically balancing the different competing needs for finite transit agency resources. So the example on the left-hand side is what Maryland Transit Administration did. They developed an asset management directive. And this really just gets to the point of saying, this is what our TAM is, and this is what it really means for our transit agency. So think about developing something that is very easy to communicate. And then you also need to think about these acronyms that we throw around, like state of good repair. And this is really an industry term. I mean, it's something that is jargon, and we really need to define this term. I mean, beyond meaning that assets are in fair or better condition and not beyond their useful life, they really operate at a full level of service. And two, we really need to start thinking about how state of good repair does not mean safety. So poor conditions does not mean assets are unsafe to operate. This is just a definition of how we do it. Poor conditions, safety is really the top priority for all transit agencies, and management will always take these steps to remove assets that are unsafe from service. Vehicles that are beyond their useful life may make more frequent breakdowns and be more costly to repair as parts become obsolete, but they're not inherently unsafe, and it's important to make that distinction. Similarly, facilities that are in marginal condition need to be rehabbed or remodeled, but they do not have the qualities that make them unsafe for customers. These lower conditions may be driven by a simple item like a roof that's in need of some sort of repair or an HVAC system. So it's important to really get down and explain what these different terms mean so that your audience is able to digest it and really know that you're not leaving them with an unsafe condition. Jordan?
Great. Another question another topic you'll probably need to communicate is about backlog. Backlog is the cost of achieving state of good repair and then maintaining it over time. For many transit systems, the backlog can be very high, and it can give some of your stakeholders sticker shock. Often it's far greater than a 10-year portfolio investment. So sometimes we find it's been more effective and more realistic to discuss kind of the asset plan level of investment. The current investment portfolio will address the backlog and decrease it over time. And then the cost to maintain. Alternatively, you could also talk about how much would it cost to keep things as they are. So the cost to maintain current conditions or to achieve the targets that you've set in the future. Another question that you may get is, what happens if we don't invest in state of good repair? And so communicating the consequences of meeting or failing to meet these needs is something that you should consider. One example over on the left is something that I believe Laura's team put together at SEPTA, and it shows what the system would look like if the needs were not met. And that's a pretty dramatic way of showing how important it is to invest in state of good repair. And I believe it was successful in getting some funding. Another option is to look at different scenarios for funding and how that would impact the backlog. That's the right-hand graph. What specific investments will be, things you should be prepared to answer are what specific investments will be made if funding is increased, and then what services may need to be cut if assets are allowed to deteriorate. Soon, part of the FTA rule is that transit properties must submit their asset inventory and information about condition as well as their targets to the National Transit Database. And soon that information some of that information will become public for the first time. We anticipate that you'll probably be getting, since you have savvy external stakeholders, some questions about how you perform relative to your peers, or how you perform relative to what you said you were going to do. So one question you may get is, why didn't we meet our targets last year? And one way you could answer that is, performance targets are a best guess about where your agency would be at the end of its fiscal year, but there's things that happen. Delays in procurement, emergency reprogramming of funds, service needs that require you to keep assets longer than you thought. Those are reasons that things may change and you may not meet your targets. I would also refer people back to your transit asset management plan, because that's really your roadmap for meeting targets in the long term and about how you're going to improve the conditions of your assets.
So comparing with other peer agencies is just a natural thing, as Jordan had mentioned. So, someone's going to ask this question and say, how do we compare with our peer regions? And if you look at that data and, you start seeing that your asset conditions aren't looking as well as some of the others, and your targets aren't as good as you would like them to be, you're going to have to kind of answer that question. And you just have to recognize and just put it on the table that, look, current conditions are a result of what resources were dedicated to state of grid repair over the last 10 to 20 years. These things don't happen overnight. This TAM plan, though, is looking forward, and it's saying, okay, how do we ensure that this agency is in a better place in the next 10 years? So asset management is really about understanding what the agency owns and planning for maintenance, rehab, and replacement to ensure that it gets the maximum value from its assets. And that TAM plan really helps you manage these things going forward.
Great. So if you didn't meet your targets this year, they could say, what are we doing? Or they don't like how you compare to your peer agencies. You could get asked, so what are we doing to lower our targets in the future? And then this is another great place to point people to your transit asset management plan. Because that outlines the process that you'll be using to prioritize which assets to replace and rehab first, given your current resources, and it lists your planned investments. And ideally, you should be able to project out how those investments will improve targets in the future. And so, again, I think a TAM plan can be a great resource in answering these questions.
Another question, how's it okay to have a performance targets that 60% of our vehicles are beyond their useful life? This happens in the real world, yes. So, and then how much is it going to cost to basically get us up to a new area? And then, what are we doing to make our targets better in the future? And you really, again, that's what this TAM plan is all about. They're based upon current resources, investment plans. The targets look ahead only 1 year. So 1 year is just not enough time to move a lot of things in transit agencies. There's procurement timing, there's availment of capital funds. This target setting process provides the opportunity to talk about resource needs and trade-offs. And in most cases, better costs cost more money, or better performance costs more money, and that's just the way things happen. So, for example, setting more aggressive targets may require more financial resources or reprogramming of funds from non-state of good repair projects. Targets also have to take into account the agency's capacity to implement a capital program. And with the lead times, as we had mentioned before, and the juggling of all the different types of funding, that is a harder task than many people understand. Also, staff resources are limited, and also things like track access to try to make these things happen. So you need to be prepared for these types of questions, and they're good logical questions that people can understand in terms of how long it takes to move the needle and what it takes to move the needle.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and I think Todd touched on the answer to how much will it cost to reduce the target to your peer agencies level. That's where you can project out and tell them, figure out if that were our target, this is how much it would cost, and this is the additional money we would need or the trade-offs that we would have to make to get there. Other questions you may get are about if your projections change over time, if your projections of asset condition or your projections of investment needs change over time. People may question why. And the first thing is to realize it's totally normal for that to happen. You're in good company for projections to change over time, but it's really important to be transparent as to why. It could be that you just had more detail about inventory, or you had a better assessment process for your asset condition ratings. Maybe your modeling approach changed. Maybe you used a different value of money. Or maybe it really was a change into your asset condition. It was a true result of the investments you've been making. But the best answer there, though, is to be transparent about why.
Another item that may come up is, how do these numbers in this TAM plan relate to the needs estimates and other documents? Well, being from an MPO, I know that we wrestle with this internally also. These TAM plans are developed at a specific time period, and they may not be developed at the same time as an MPO long-range plan or a transportation improvement plan or your state capital investment plan, depending upon the different types of funding sources. So recognizing that these documents are produced at different times, you're going to have different perspectives on the condition and investment needs. And then also there may be different analysis time zones. MPO long-range plans are 20+ years into the future. And there's the points as to whether or not these documents in these different areas are fiscally constrained and other parameters that go along with them. So it's just important to make sure that you get the data and the analysis out there from your transit asset management plan to make sure that it helps inform some of these other analysis. So with that, we would like to thank you, and I think what we'll do is we will be moving on to questions.
Great. Thank you, Jordan and Todd. You guys are fantastic presenters for this particular subject matter. Jordan just has such a gift for talking about her challenges of communicating within her multimodal transportation agency. And Todd is always fantastic at explaining, especially to me when I'm struggling as an agency person to understand what the external stakeholders want to hear and why. Todd is always fantastic explaining those sorts of things to me. I also wanted to let you know that we have been joined by Mish Smith. Mish doesn't really need an introduction, but she is our TAM program manager at the FTA. She works with a small staff at headquarters, as well as her regional TAM experts to help everybody as they are going through the mechanics of implementing and improving their asset management programs. So that all being said, I wanted to open up the floor for questions. If you have a question, please put them in the question box and we will answer them as best that we can. Okay, we do not have any questions so far. So I'm actually going to pose one to our panelists. Jordan or Todd, do you have any success stories at your own agencies about communication with external stakeholders that you'd be willing to share with the group?
Well, I know that we at the Baltimore Metropolitan region are working with a very capable agency, the Maryland Transit Administration, and I don't mind saying that we have a very great partnership with our transit agency. And they've put out some very challenging documents talking about a lot of state of good repair backlogs and needs, and it's new ground for all of us, really having all of these documented needs on a very specific basis for this type of a time period, and trying to understand how do we try to tackle it. And I think what we've been able to do is really change the mindset of some of the people in our region of immediately looking at the shiny thing, as Jordan had mentioned about, that brand new rail line, that everyone wants to have, and really understanding what the state of good repair needs are, and that we really need to tackle those along with also trying to provide more service. Mm-hmm. So I think this has been a great partnership, and also sharing data has been a great success. Our transit agency is also the tier agency group plan sponsor, and what they've done is they take all of the transit information for the entire state for all of the locally operated transit systems, and they've worked with us to actually share the specific information of the small transit agencies in our region so that we were able to set regional targets as opposed to just taking the state target as it is. Jordan?
Yeah, a few years ago we released a capital needs inventory on our website, or to our stakeholders, and we're able to communicate what our state of good repair needs were, and successfully we're able to convince them that our current funding stream wasn't predictable enough for us to be able to address them, and they all agreed to provide us with dedicated funding over the next 10 years so that we could really work at addressing state of good repair and decreasing our backlog. So it's been our stakeholders have been great partners with us at WMATA to really kind of move us more towards better asset management.
Great. So we've had a couple of questions pop in. The first one is, I'm going to let all of you take a crack at this one. What do you like best, and what is the biggest challenge of working in TAM?
So this is Todd. I'll take a shot at that. So we were working with different business leaders in the Baltimore region yesterday, and when you're faced with large needs across many different modes, and there's just a gigantic dollar amount that's attached to it on an annual basis, we've been told that just handing over a big sum of money just to try to provide better maintenance is never an easy sell. You really need to get down into the story of, okay, what's going to happen if that additional money is not provided, or if the focus doesn't shift to try to addressing these specific needs? What are the ramifications that come from those? So actually telling the kind of detailed story is very important, even though you need to lay out the bare facts about the large numbers also. I think that's been the hardest thing.
Mm-hmm.
This is Jordan. I'll talk about what I like best about it, which is the fact that it does touch so many different internal and external stakeholders, and it's really I really enjoy being able to see other people's perspectives and help communicate how TAM can help them achieve or help us achieve common goals. So I think that's actually what I enjoy most about it.
Hi, this is Victor. From the internal stakeholder perspective, I would like to add that the Transit Asset Management Plan has some challenges because the organization has many players, many roles, many responsibilities. Therefore, it is important that the message comes across in such a way that it's tailored to the individual perspective of the groups being addressed. So that's a challenge that the asset manager needs to be very mindful of. So the message is targeted, direct, to the point, depending on the audience.
Okay. I'm going to take a crack at this one too. My favorite thing that I've seen since I've started doing asset management is really seeing the collaboration between groups that didn't necessarily talk to each other before. And I've also been really excited, since we've been putting together so much data as a larger legacy system, we didn't have a lot of data readily available. So working with some of our subject matter experts to put all the data together and seeing some of the younger employees take that data and be excited about collecting it and seeing a purpose for what they were actually doing has been really rewarding here at SEPTA. Okay. So we have another question, and I guess this will be for everybody as well. Since this is a relatively new focus within transit, have you developed communication strategies to talk to your coworkers about what we're up to here?
Sure, this is Jordan. I'll go. Yeah, I found that actually we've done a mixture of some training, so some kind of larger groups. This is what TAM is. This is what your role is in it. But I've also found it effective to go talk to people in smaller groups, one-on-one, and kind of allows you to tailor it more specifically to how it affects them and what it is. And I found people get really engaged when you're able to have those types of conversations. So often go with just like a brief PowerPoint deck and and then kind of see where the conversation leads.
Todd, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Sure. I mean, in the MPO setting, we not only have to deal with transit asset management, but there are a number of other federally required performance measures for highway and pavement and safety and congestion. So really juggling all of these different items, it's great to have all of this data, and we really need, as community stakeholder partners, we really need to work very closely with our transit agencies to make sure that we're telling the right story. And I think it's built a much closer relationship between our MPO and our transit agency. So, you know, we view ourselves as co-workers in this kind of theme of trying to make the transit asset management plan as useful as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Laura, would you mind if I took a stab at that one? This is Ms. Shadoni.
Go for it, Mish.
Sure, because this is a big part of what I do, is developing those communication strategies. And I think it's really important to realize that the role is twofold. You're not only an educator in terms of what asset management is, either for that individual as your coworker, where they fit in, but you're also a motivator. So you're trying to motivate them or encourage them in terms of how they can be an asset in the asset management process and program. So you're getting buy-in at all levels, not just from the executive level or from your external stakeholders, but also from your coworkers and even your staff and employees. The whole process, because it's still relatively a new concept, is you're trying to build that motivation, momentum, as well as educate what they can do in order to help the agency achieve its goals.
And that is a great part. You're constantly in this role of asking people for help, explaining what you're doing, and not trying to critique whatever processes they've already got in place. Great. Okay. We don't have any other questions, so I'm going to give the audience a minute or two more to chime in. I do have one other question for the panel. As we've, some of us have been doing the asset management thing for 5, 6, 7 years now. Have you seen a change at your agencies as to how well this effort is being received and the level of cooperation that you've had?
I'll go. This is Jordan. I would say definitely. It's, you no longer have to start at, often at kind of square zero, so to speak. People are more comfortable. When you say TAM, people actually know what it means. So that's a big step. And I think they're starting, it's starting to, people are adopting the practices as well. They may not always call it actually TAM, although they said they know what TAM is, but they're starting to do it more. And so I think it's been really fun to see that take hold and happen.
And it, as we evolve from just the kind of requirement to put out this plan, I think the information is becoming, better and, more complete, which is an important thing because we're, with the timelines and trying to make sure that all the facilities were, properly inspected and that this filtered all the way down to a lot of the smaller transit agencies, we're really starting to get a much truer picture as to the state of assets. And we're getting better at also sharing the data amongst agencies. And I know that FTA is working on a lot of other items to try to help that information sharing. So again, just talking and having people at the table. We've always talked about having transit at the table is very important. And now that we are able to understand, their challenges in terms of state of good repair needs, I think it's easier for external stakeholders to really understand, how to try to work with the transit agencies to make sure that, they get what they need.
Right. Go ahead, Victor.
Yes, and if I may add something, I'm going to put my MBTA hat as a capital program manager. And I have to say that the role of always informing stakeholders is critical. In the process of us developing the capital program, we needed help from the departments to update and upgrade our asset inventory. And the more information, the more tailored they were, the information that went out was, that allowed us to gain buy-in from the various departments and trust and strong relationships. So at the time when we needed to work on the asset inventory, it was an easy transition. So I must say that this is a continuum. It's something that needs to be strengthened over time, and it takes effort, and it has to be sustained.
Yeah, I'll say at SEPTA, when we first started out, it was kind of like, we would get questions like, why do you do that information that's already on the track charts? And then you would dig a little bit and find out that it wasn't necessarily all there. But it was really not, in some ways, not until we had actually gone through the exercise of explaining what the impact of the backlog of state of good repair needs was on the actual service delivery that people really trusted our group to say that we weren't there to audit, we were trying to be advocates for them and for the work that they try so hard to do. And since that time we have, of course things aren't perfect, but it's certainly helped to build up a lot of trust in what we were doing with the information and why we were asking for it. And we're getting some feedback that cooperation is definitely improving at other agencies throughout the country as well in the chat box here. So we have answered all of the audience questions. I want to, at this time, thank our panel, Victor, Jordan, Todd, Lexa, and Mish for getting on the phone, for talking about communication and how important it is. And we all know that as communication improves, our advancement of the practice of asset management will improve as well. Thank you all for joining us for the webinar, and we look forward to talking to you again in a few months.